Max Kinner is founder and executive director of the Bard Prison Initiative, which enrolls incarcerated women and men in academic programs that culminate in degrees from Bard College in New York. Since 1999, BPI has been a leader in college and prison programming, with 550 degrees conferred and currently enrolling over 300 incarcerated students. Max is a leading advocate for college and prison programming in our nation. He is co-founder of the Consortium for the Liberal Arts in Prison, which supports colleges and universities in establishing college and prison projects nationwide, and also of the Bard Microcollege, which establishes rigorous tuition-free college opportunities within urban areas in partnership with community-based institutions. For those interested in learning more about the Bard Prison Initiative following Max's talk, I highly recommend watching the 2019 documentary College Behind Bars, which is available for free on PBS at pbs.org and features the stories of many of the incarcerated students involved in the BPI program. I'll share the link to this film in the chat as well tonight. And with that, I just want to thank you, Max, for joining us and turn the floor over to you.
My pleasure, Michael. It's a thrill to be here with you tonight. I want to thank you and everyone at the Kegley Institute of Ethics, California Humanities, and also give a special acknowledgement, shout out to my colleagues and friends over at Project Rebound and everyone in this field doing really important work all across California. It's terrific to be here. It is an extraordinary moment in time for our field of college and prison, a field that was robust and lively, represented in all 50 states for decades until the middle 1990s, and a field that was really decimated then with the Clinton crime bill, and then has grown gradually over time, supported by a increasingly broad and radically diverse group of advocates, and has just in the last few months, this December, experienced the largest, the ultimate policy victory that we could, and are on the cusp of radical expansion. If you're like me in this field, you've spent nearly 25 years arguing that college and prison should be, and that fight is now over. That fight has been won. The fight that follows will be more difficult, more challenging, more vexing, more controversial, more divisive. And that will be the question of what college and prison should be. So again, my name is Max Kenner. I'm the founder and executive director of something called the Bard Prison Initiative. We'll refer to it tonight as BPI. BPI at its essence is something quite simple, in many ways quite conservative, and really fundamental. And what we do at BPI is simply provide a college education to terrific college undergraduates. And we work to do that as closely, as seamlessly, as proximate, as similarly to our students as we do on campus. But we offer the college programs that we do primarily in state prisons. College and prison, as I referred to a few minutes ago, was standard operating procedure in the United States until 1994. It has a history that started really to emerge in the modern era during the Nixon administration. Some posit the origins happening after Attica, but has a much longer history that we'll talk a little bit about tonight. The most important fundamental history of college and prison is that as the prison system in the United States grew dramatically in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s in a horrific, awful, budget-busting, and spirit-crushing kind of way, there also is an undercurrent, and we'll talk more about this also, this subplot of optimism, hope, camaraderie, and intellectual life that followed from the springing up of small little college programs, colleges themselves, in prisons all across the United States through this period. And these programs over these decades had a remarkable track record. At precisely these moments when the most prominent intellectuals, the leaders of all the graduate schools in education and the fields called criminology or whatever they were called at the time, all sought to prove how bad people were, how little they were capable of, how much worse they were than their parents. College and prison did something extraordinary. It did more to reduce recidivism, the rate at which people return to prison after release. It did more to reduce violence within an institution. It did more to restore relationships between an incarcerated person and her or his family on the outside. It did more to increase likelihood of gainful employment, and reductions in recidivism were not pegged to increases in employment. In other words, it did all the things that I think, if you're going to spend money on something like a prison, that you or I would hope might be accomplished in that prison. And it did all of those things radically less expensively than almost anything else we did in corrections in this time. This is a place, American prisons, where we can spend $250,000 replacing a door. Nevertheless, despite the fact that this was the one positive and humanizing through line in this awful story over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, despite the fact that it was obvious that these college programs saved money, reduced crime, increased public safety, and returned college opportunity to precisely members of those communities that our colleges and universities fail most often. Despite that, college and prison was destroyed with the Clinton crime bill in 1994, when people in prison were made specifically ineligible for federal Pell Grants. We'll talk more about the details of that later on in this discussion. But BPI, the program that I run, does a handful of things. It was one of a very small number of privately funded programs that emerged in the late 1990s, very early 2000s, to prove that this work was still meaningful. And because that really matters, because a fundamental tenet in the field is that people in prison matter, their lives matter, to do the work itself. And so over the course of the last 2+ decades, we've built a college within the prison system in New York that resembles and often exceeds the basic academic expectation, rigor, and breadth of a place like Bard College itself, a place where elite high school students come to study from the fanciest high schools in New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, Miami, but also East Asia, Africa, Europe, you name it. Students study a full breadth of a liberal arts curriculum, math, science, the arts, Spanish, French, German languages. They engage in extracurricular college activities, including building organic gardens, joining a debate union, participating and honoring and doing the arts. And these students not only don't go back to prison after release, these students return to their communities, the ones that they left behind, and go on to achieve extraordinary things. BPI students have gone on to complete graduate degrees, terminal degrees at places like Columbia, Georgetown, NYU, Yale University. They work in senior leadership positions in government agencies, in non-for-profits, and advocacy organizations, working to close Rikers Island, working to maintain relationships between the mayor's office here in New York City and people in public housing, working to improve conditions for people living in food deserts, you name it. At BPI, we've also spent time establishing something called the Consortium for the Liberal Arts in Prison, engaging other first-rate college universities to enter this field and engage incarcerated students in a serious and ambitious way and share them with them the wealth, the social networks, et cetera, that are inherent and that they expect to share with conventional students on campus. So as I said, this is a pivotal moment for our field, and I want to spend our time together tonight talking a little bit of how we got here and also sharing some observations that I have made along the way and that might be useful as we move into this moment, determining what college in prison will be now that we know it will exist. It will change lives for more better, hopeful, presumably not for worse, and in some way. And the stakes of what we do have increased dramatically. So I'm going to oscillate a little bit tonight in the time that I have with you between some history and some original research that I've done. Again, some of these observations, some abstract, some concrete, and then some historical anecdotes. And if we were in person, I would say, please jump in and interrupt me at any point. But I would say I do look forward to a Q&A after we're done. College in prison is necessarily, or at least if it's going to be done well, a practice that's amorphous and essentially shape-shifting. Like all things, it has markedly different meanings depending on one's perspective or moment in time. But it's especially true in this slippery and ethically challenging terrain that we work in, which are the prisons themselves. College in prison can and has been described as essentially accommodationist. From this perspective, typically told by a prison abolitionist, college opportunity is a modest reform that slightly improves the prison, but also sustains and empowers it. By making the prison better, we make the world worse. Then college in prison is also understood as a profound affirmation of the expanse and realms of possibility that exist within each of us, that the breadth of our interior lives cannot be contained by the walls or the wires that make up the prison, and that therefore college in prison represents a kind of true freedom that cannot be confiscated. This is the college in prison of the Talmud, in which when you rescue one person, you rescue an entire universe. It's the college in prison of the professor and the pastor, the rabbi, or the priest. College in prison still can be understood as a radical response to the ongoing reality of anti-Blackness and racism in the United States. What really do lasting and meaningful reparations look like, if not tuition-free college opportunity for those Americans who were most oppressed, who suffer from the most direct aggression from the state that seeks to limit their futures and freedom? If not opening the libraries and social networks and resources of the college built for the children of the elite to people like those who are incarcerated, again, what do reparations look like? All of these descriptions, and we could outline many more, but don't have time here tonight, are fundamentally right in their own way and none of them are wrong. College and prison is electric, it's cutting edge, it's uniquely rich in its impact and symbolic value. And because of all that, it's vital and wildly fulfilling work. It's also bastardized, it's reactive, we are characterized by our own inherent institutional weakness because we're always responding and working within the prison itself. We don't have independence. We don't speak truth to power. The little pockets of independence we do create within the prison, though, are then unusually liberating and powerful, precisely because of their limitations. It's worth noting a particular dynamic that maybe is peculiar to the United States, where ideas about education and freedom have a particular connectivity. Here in the United States, there have always been groups of people who've taken better advantage of a little bit of college access, better than most of the rest of us. The first, the classic, most timeless group, of course, are immigrants of any era. We should never forget that veterans of foreign wars, overwhelmingly for the better, transformed the landscape of higher education in the second half of the 20th century in the United States. And in the 1930s, the best learning colleges in the United States were community colleges in New York City, filled with people, immigrants from Eastern Europe, for whom, Jewish people, for whom the Ivy Leagues held a quota. And we never, ever talk about it. We don't honor it in the United States. But no group of Americans ever achieved so much with just a little bit of educational opportunity than the generation or so of Americans who experienced emancipation from slavery. The scale of achievement from the Deep South, where teaching and learning were punishable by death, to the Harlem Renaissance, is something all Americans should be aware of. And so tonight, I'm here to suggest that today in our United States, incarcerated Americans are analogous to those groups of people. They're people that will take the most with a little bit of access, a little bit of opportunity to education. And they represent those people at a moment when we have such cynicism about education itself, about the relevance, the salience of intellectual life and of learning. And therefore, we have more to learn from them than we could ever really imagine. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the history of our field. I talked at the very beginning, outlining what is really kind of the back of the envelope, the popular understanding of the field, which at least as I was first taught it, and I've been doing this work really since I was in college, my whole adult life. What I was taught when I was in college was counterintuitive. It kind of didn't make sense. It was a story about how there was the rebellion at Attica, a public response to it, and college and prison grew from there. What was counterintuitive about that, even though there's quite a bit of truth to it, is that the idea that America saw Attica and made prisons better seemed backwards, right? Attica happened and then mass incarceration happened. So there was something else that had to be going on. So a couple of years ago, I set out to do some research and learn more about the field. And I was inspired largely by an article published by a colleague of mine, Jed Tucker, who discovered documentation that the most famous, the most celebrated incarcerated American of the 20th century went to college and prison in the 1940s. In Massachusetts, at Norfolk Correctional Institution, Malcolm X enrolled in college. I think we can all think of Malcolm X as kind of the archetypal, maybe the original modern incarcerated American, right? Someone who wasn't incarcerated in a way that resembled incarceration of a generation before him, but did of all kinds of men much more after him. And college and prison grows at a slow, simmering pace through the 1950s and 1960s through a period of post-war optimism. That expansion happens primarily in the federal prison system, but by the end of the 1960s, during the Great Society, when Congress establishes and then dramatically grows the federal Pell Grants, there is a funding mechanism for college and prison to spring about everywhere. However, it's also a moment of real disenchantment with the prison system and a sense that prisons aren't doing what they should. And there were articles, magazines in the Washington Post predicting that there would be no more prisons in the United States in a few years. And that's worth dwelling on for a moment, because of course, that was the moment when mass incarceration began, not when prisons came to an end. And so what you have is, through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, this extraordinary growth in our prison system, this reaction to the relative successes of the Civil Rights Revolution. And then also within these institutions, these pockets, again, of hope, of liberation, of agency, of something different. And it wasn't until really the middle to late 1980s that American reactionaries started to really object to this kind of work. And that was a reverse kind of slow simmer that resulted with the Clinton crime bill, an enormous bill we hear a lot about now because of Joe Biden's role in writing it, et cetera, a bill that allocated between $7 and $8 billion for prison construction across the country. But the most symbolic thing that that bill did, not the most meaningful thing that the bill did, but the most symbolic thing it did was destroy education in prisons, because it said to all of us that not only were prisons more important than ever, but that people within them were less important than ever. And as those programs were destroyed, there were a handful of things that happened that were counterintuitive, because all along, it wasn't just incarcerated people or advocates or their families that knew these programs were terrific. It was often the jailers themselves. And there were some states that worked to preserve college and prison. And I want to highlight just one of them, where a strange deal was made in a state where there was some of the most robust systems for this kind of work, and that was in Ohio. And it was the state commissioner in Ohio who sought to preserve those programs and ultimately cut a deal with the state legislature such that they would survive. And that deal was, you can do college in your prisons on two conditions: that work not culminate in a degree, and there'll be no liberal arts curriculum. And that compromise illustrates the values that have dominated this debate for so long. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the ideas that have girded this field, the context in which we worked this entire time, the past 20 years, some of the sentiments, and really the context being, not just for mass incarceration, but for those of us who worked in college and prison, being reaction to the Civil Rights Revolution, the Reagan era, and that whole expanse of conservative and reactionary dominance in American life. And in thinking about that, I just want to pose a few kind of paradoxes of historicity and just point out that if you, Michael, were a radical abolitionist in the 1850s, and an oracle came to you and said, by 1865, slavery is going to be abolished completely in the United States, you would be overwhelmed by the impossibility of that and how just unbelievably terrific and meaningful that could be. But if that oracle then said to you, then described for you what labor conditions in the South would be like by the late 1880s and 1890s, that would be a radically difficult thing to contend with, right? And if you were a bureaucrat in the 1930s and 40s building the New Deal, and someone could articulate, you could encounter that same oracle, and they could say to you that you were going to be successful in building the largest, most sustained, broadest, most wealthy middle class in the history of the human race, you'd be overwhelmed. But that person could also then tell you that you were building a system of exclusion, racism, that would last longer than the wealth and prosperity of that middle class. And if you were a freedom rider in 1962 or 1963, and that oracle could explain to you the scale of the success of the civil rights revolution, you would not be able to comprehend how good, how successful your movement would be. But if that oracle then told you that 50 years later, there'd be more African-American men in the United States without the right to vote than there were in 1962, what would you do with that knowledge? And I say that because at every moment of despair, we have to remember that history changes quickly, and we have to be optimistic. And at every moment of triumph, we have to gird ourselves both for failure and also for radical unintended consequences of our own success. The work we've done in college and prison, I think, is about a certain amount of modesty. It's not about potential success, for example, of protest movements to change history quickly. It's about building institutions that last and invest in people over generations. Before I wrap up, I want to spend a few minutes, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, talking about this moment and our big win, the restoration of Pell eligibility. And I want to shout out primarily the enormous commitment of formerly incarcerated people who made that happen. But point to a handful of final paradoxes for them for tonight. We have triumphed, Pell is restored, and as we've said, college and prison will be. And now the challenge is what it will be. Will it represent an expansion of the prison and a modestly improved allocation of services that aim to be rehabilitative? Or will college and prison represent a radical expansion of college access, delivering the best of what our universities have to offer directly to members of our communities that our universities fail most often? Do they represent a belief in the humanities and the arts and sciences that have fueled the best of what we've accomplished in American history, or a kind of cynicism that represents the worst and most racist in the United States? In wrapping up, there are two anecdotes I want to share that I think are good fodder for thinking. One is, in all the joy of the past few months in our success and knowing that we're going to build hundreds of new colleges across the country in the coming years, I've also felt a sense of rage, of anger. In New York today, there are literally half as many people in prison as there were when we got started at BPI in 1999. That's not true necessarily nationally, but in general, we are in a moment of decarceration. And it is devastatingly ironic to me that the work is more celebrated and more popular when it's hard for me to say this as a professional fundraiser or someone who does the work every day, but less important than it was. When prisons were most central to us in the United States, philanthropy wasn't looking, progressives weren't looking, universities weren't looking, media wasn't looking. We all agreed prisons should be the worst when they were most important. And I have trouble moving past that reality. And as much as I want to champion college and prison and will continue to champion college and prison, I also challenge everyone in this audience to imagine, where is that place today? Where is that place today which, if I were to go, if you were to go and do the best thing, that would make my friends, my neighbors outraged at me because it was perceived as being the wrong thing to do. And the last thing, the anecdote I want to share, which I don't often do publicly, but because I'm speaking at a university, at a college, and because I find a increasing cynicism in some of campus politics and an ironic punitiveness in campus politics, I want to share one anecdote about the origins of BPI. And that was when I was an undergraduate at Bard. There was an incident where police came to campus and arrested and abused an African-American student, and it led to all kinds of unrest. And I was involved in a group of students who did all kinds of advocacy and activism at that time. And we brought two leaders of the Black Panther Party to campus, Bobby Seale and David Hilliard. And we had a private meeting with a group of overwhelmingly African-American students, myself, a few others, one or two administrators of the college, maybe none, I can't remember exactly, maybe one, and Bobby Seale and David Hilliard. And the undergraduates described the situation at the college. The former leadership of the Panther Party dictated what they thought the undergraduates should do, XYZ, ABC, etc. The undergraduate said, that's incredible, that's exactly what we've done. And Bobby Seale and David Hilliard respond and say something to the effect of, what did the college say? And the undergraduates say, they gave us everything we wanted. And then Bobby and David reply something to the effect of, well, what's the problem then? And it was a terrible discussion that left everyone feeling misunderstood and unhappy with one another, misunderstanding one another. But it also left me with the sense that as campus-based advocates, as undergraduates, that sometimes we were incapable, unwilling, or maybe even undesirous of getting to yes. And it inspired some of us to think about, what would it look like were we to get to yes? What would it look like if we were to challenge authorities, decision makers, to do something they could do that we would be satisfied with? And that is one way of telling the origin story of the Bard Prison Initiative. It was a challenge to authorities to do something that was in their power to do, in the mission of the college to do, but also was the most radical expansion of college access we could imagine at that time in 1999. And so today, as we face ongoing crises of bigotry, violence, racism in the United States, a level of inequality that is beyond what our comprehension was in 1999, and the climate emergency. We need to be able to challenge authorities both in ways where we can get to yes, but also where we can, I hope, be inspired by the kinds of achievement of incarcerated Americans that are perceived to be impossible, and recognize that we can and must have achievements that the generation before us would perceive as being unlikely or even impossible.
Thank you so much, Max, for the fascinating talk and the education. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to engaging in Q&A with our audience. We do have some questions in the queue already, and I'll just encourage everyone again, don't be shy. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in. I know Max said before we started the talk, this is one of his favorite parts of these events, so happy to engage in Q&A. Max, the first question comes from Christy, and Christy notes, 2 years ago, Kern County's One Book Project, which is a kind of a common read project throughout the city in several different institutions, featured Baz Dreisinger's Incarceration Nations. And she asks, does the Bard College Prison Initiative work with the program at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, first of all? And second, how does the growth of the private prison industry in the US affect the number of prison to college programs nationally?
Sure. So we know Baz well. We've worked with him for a long time. John Jay is a large member of our small community here in New York. So excuse me, we know them well. And they have a small college and prison program. But we work more closely on the reentry side, post-release, where many of our students go back and complete degrees if they haven't completed them while incarcerated within the CUNY system. And John Jay is filled with really terrific colleagues. On the private prison question, I would say two things. Historically, I think the impact, the breadth, the scale, the import of the problem of private prisons has been overblown. That's not to say that their existence is not an outrage, but that the overwhelming majority of people in the United States are incarcerated in public prisons. And that's where the bulk of the problem lies. The Southwest is a little bit of an exception to that rule. But generally, this is a public institution problem, not a private institution problem. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, in recent years, starting in the Obama administration and increasing dramatically, of course, under Donald Trump, the private detention center crisis, particularly for undocumented people, has grown astronomically. Now, we don't have college and prison in camps for undocumented people, so it does not impact our little field too much. But for prisons in and for American citizens, the problem of private prisons, in my view, is overstated. At the border with ICE, it is not at all overstated and needs to be taken seriously.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Christy, for your question. Max, the next question comes from Maritza, and I'll read her question, but I take it as in part asking about who is eligible for engaging in BPI programming. But Maritza writes, from what I understand, only those with a short sentence have the opportunity to attend college behind bars. But what about those with a longer sentence? Do you believe one day there will be courses available for all?
So that's a terrific question, and it cuts right to the heart of what we do. It's not something I spent too much time talking about this evening, but at BPI, and this is characteristic of the field broadly. Not everyone in the field has the freedom to make these decisions for themselves. Sometimes the prisons intervene, but it's true of the field broadly, that we work very hard to make sure that a person's conviction, their sentence, the amount of time they have left in prison, their institutional record within the prison, all are removed from consideration when a person applies to college. That is to say, we have students with 6 months left in prison, and we have students with something resembling life left in prison. We do not discriminate, and we don't discriminate either based on educational history. There's no institutional history that we honor when we do admission to the college. So we have many long-term people. And in fact, our programs are most vital in slightly longer-term institutions.
Thank you, Max. And Maritza, thank you for the question.
And just to say to Maritza, just because that is not true of BPI, and generally practitioners try to make sure that's not true, the question is well informed in that decision makers and elected officials in particular often try to create these kind of impositions.
Fantastic. The next question comes from Kara, or Kara. Forgive if I'm mispronouncing. And she writes, can you talk a bit more about who was championing college and prisons in the 70s and 80s during that period of intense prison expansion? And while the groundwork of intense fear was being laid in the public, are you able to pinpoint when the tide shifted and led to the crime bill in 1994?
Sure, that's a great question. And, I've researched and written about this. I've spent my whole career in the field. I'm something of an expert. But one thing that I would say is that no one knows, right? One thing that is fascinating and mysterious and intriguing and it relates to the nature, just the technical bureaucratic nature of how the Pell Grants are administered, is that there is no tracking. There is no, you can find citations of, social scientists or government agencies claiming to have a precise number of how many college and prison programs there were in the country at any given moment. There is no such thing. We don't have those numbers. There's no consensus on what defines a college and prison program. So really, I think the people that were behind the institution of the establishment of these programs through the 70s and 80s, there are three groups of people that deserve the credit. They're some of the people who ran the prisons, who allowed it to happen or sometimes sought it out to happen. Even more than them, they are college faculty and administrators who made it happen. And more than either of those groups, they're incarcerated people themselves who advocated and sought for this to happen. The reaction to college and prison happens gradually over the 1980s. The first real public comments that I can find in opposition start happening in kind of 1983, 84, again, culminating in the crime bill in 94. And through that period of time in the 1980s, you have an increasing, obviously beginning with Nixon all the way back in the very early 1970s, but you have an increasing vitriolic public discourse about crime, about people in prison, about the neighborhoods that are most policed. Again, obviously this is wildly racialized and repulsive. But you also have simultaneous to that an increasingly punitive language being deployed by elected officials and people in the media about college life, about education, about ways to restrict access, to take away access, to make college more expensive and less substantive. And those two currents are happening at once.
Thank you, Max. And Kara, thank you for the question. A lot of great questions tonight. These are really fantastic. The next one comes from Kelly. And Kelly asks, can you speak about the different educational opportunities and challenges in male versus female prisons?
Sure. First of all, I hate to generalize. The first thing I would say is that many people in the audience probably know this, but for quite some time, women have represented the largest, fastest growing demographic in American prisons, but they also represent a significant minority in American prisons. So it's very different demographics, very different kinds of types of people in men's and women's prisons in a lot of different ways. Fundamentally, if I could point to one difference between a men's and a women's prison, is that generally speaking, obviously not always, men receive quite a bit of support from their families and communities in a way that heartbreakingly, very often women don't. In general, and this is the main thing that impacts our academic programs for women as opposed to men. We're in 5 prisons for men, 1 for women. We'd like to enroll more incarcerated women. We struggle doing that. The main difference is the amount of time, at least in New York State. You know, the average male student we have enrolls at Bard for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We are lucky with our students that are women if they are with us for 2 or 3 or 4 semesters.
Thank you, Max. Max, this question comes from Sherry, and she notes, I teach in the English department at a private university that recently started offering degree programs at a medium security correctional facility for men. We didn't know we'd get funding until late in the game, so we didn't have much time for training and professional development. And then COVID hit, so other things took priority. What are some go-to resources for educators who are new to working in correctional facilities?
So first of all, I just have to extend my sympathies to anyone who got into this field just before COVID. This is a wildly fulfilling field in which to work because of the human work and the cost of doing business. In other words, dealing with the jails is very high. During COVID, you've only had the downside and none of the upside. So it's been an ironic time to have the restoration of Pell and decarceration along with COVID and the advent of this kind of conversation over Zoom. I think Kelly is the name of the one with the question, or?
Sherry.
Sherry, excuse me, Sherry. This is something that we do at BPI. You should feel free to reach out to me to talk about this. We provide technical assistance, try to help people along the way. But if there were 2 or 3 things I would say off the bat, the first is you should expect this to be a huge amount of work. It requires real commitment. It's not something you can do on the side. But that being said, you need to expect a lot of the jailers, and you need to respect the authority of the college that you bring along with it if you're going to serve your students in the best possible way. And lastly, most importantly, don't presume that you know what those students in prison are interested in, capable of, or inspired by. Too often, we as college faculty and administrators project our politics, our interests, our prejudice onto incarcerated people. And if we're going to serve them well as students, we will offer them as a curriculum as broad and as meaningful as we do on campus.
Max, I wanted to follow up on Sherry's question about COVID-19. I mean, I think there's not a person on the webinar with us tonight who hasn't been impacted by COVID. And there's also many educators and students on the webinar tonight. Can you talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the BPI program and how you've been still delivering high quality educational work in the COVID-19 era?
I like to think that we're still delivering high quality college educational work. The first thing I would say is that this past year has been positively terrifying. And it's been terrifying for 2 ways. First of all, of course, it's terrifying because we worry for the physical, medical health of our colleagues, students, and friends who are incarcerated. It's a dangerous place to be, and medical care is poor, and that's real. But we also are terrified because it's a period of time when there are no outsiders in the prisons. We have no idea what's happening in the prisons. I don't want to exaggerate the positive impact that outsiders like us have within these institutions because it's quite limited, but it's radically better than nothing. And that doubt, that mystery, that loss of kind of muscle memory on the part of the people who run the prisons and having to contend with aggravating, demanding people like me is scary, is bad. And we don't know what's happening there. And so That is the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is pertaining again to this kind of technology. We're determined at BPI that to make sure that this crisis is not an opportunity. We don't want to use this crisis as a means to have more conversations like this. We want to be determined to get back to where we were, because we genuinely believe that what we do has more impact when it happens in person, that prisons are the most perverse place in the country to experiment with impersonal learning. And lastly, because we believe that as much literal, trivial, data kind of learning happens in the classroom, equal amounts of learning happens because of the college community. And that happens when people are together.
Max, thank you for that response. This next question comes from Steve. Steve asks, is there an argument you give to support the importance of humanities, or specifically philosophy, courses and degrees for incarcerated people?
I don't have a philosophy specific arrow in my quiver, so I apologize off the bat. But all we do is advocate for the liberal arts and sciences. And we believe at BPI that the dichotomy between vocational and liberal education is played out, that it's ridiculous. You know, we all can study our Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and acknowledge the importance of those debates from 100 years ago. But we do not live in 1921. We live in 2021. And the best education for work in 2021 is also the best education for life in 2021. And that's a broad, meaningful liberal arts education that engages the natural world, the future, and the past.
As a philosopher, I'm going to say cheers to that. I think that's a great response. Max, thank you for that. I wanted to pick up on the humanistic theme. One of the things that people will know is the Bpi Debate Team. People may not have heard about that, but I highly recommend, if you haven't watched the documentary College Behind Bars, to watch it for several reasons. But one, you'll get to see the debate team training and performing, and it's just fantastic. Your debate team has beaten teams like Harvard's debate team, Cambridge's debate team, Brown's debate team. Can you tell us about the process of forming this team and, just your impressions of the great success that they've had?
Well, to be fair, we lost to Brown, and those kids were terrific. So,
okay.
But yes, we I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, our students established a debate union. Terrific young faculty member at Bard, who runs the debate union here on campus, David Register, got involved and started recruiting outside, terrific, first rate, outside university teams to come and compete. And so, we joke that this is the football team of BPI. It's our only opportunity to engage or compete with other universities. And most famously, because it caused a giant media sensation, there was a story in virtually every newspaper in the world about this. A story is a little bit of an exaggeration, a headline, because no one had any details or the story. Prison beats Harvard. And we can talk about debate itself, but I think what was most interesting in the prison beats Harvard media frenzy was, you've heard me talk a little bit tonight about how viscerally kind of unpopular we always imagined and felt college and prison to be, how much hostility there was to the work 20 and 25 years ago, even 15 years ago. And after the Harvard victory, there was a huge amount of press and no hostility. The Wall Street Journal loved it. The New York Post loved it. Fox News liked it. You know what I mean? No one came after us or our students in the way that we would have feared. And there are a couple things to say about that. First of all, you come to realize quite quickly how much America loves to see Harvard lose, number one. And that's funny, but true. But also, I think in the United States, we have a bigoted presumption that when something is free, that it's cheap. When we provide something at no cost, that it isn't earned. And when we are inclusive, we are dumbing things down. That when we work to bring people from all across the social strata, and particularly African Americans, into the academy, there's a racist presumption that the accomplishments that are happening are not real. And the headline, Prison Beats Harvard, implicitly, without any intellectual explanation, turn those presumptions on its head.
Yeah, super powerful. And again, just I think the process of watching that in the documentary was super striking. And we actually had a program last week for those who are interested with one of our colleagues, Kyle Robertson, who does a debate program in San Quentin prison, actually. And we've done that work actually locally in Tehachapi prison here in our region. So it's really important work. And thanks for sharing that, Max. Max, one thing you mentioned during your talk was this, accommodationist position about college and prison. And I want to ask you this because this is an argument I've heard too, not too frequently, but it's come up from time to time. In 2019, we hosted Dr. Angela Davis here for a lecture, and of course, she is a prominent prison abolitionist, and we can talk about what that means. Of course, there's different senses of what that term means, but there are people in the prison abolitionist camp who do have some views about the possibility of educational resources being a band-aid on a larger problem, or something that's embedding the mass incarceration system. So can you say more about how you think about that challenge and how you take it and how you respond to it?
Sure. So I'm going to take a few minutes for this one, and I hope you forgive me. First of all, I think one's perspective on that question depends a little bit on your positionality, right? And I just want to say before answering the question directly that I'm a college administrator. And what I am is in the market for great students. And I want to go seek those students out wherever they are, irrespective of the politics of incarceration or housing or whatever, right? I am a missionary of the gospel of the arts and sciences, right? And I want to go to find people that will do that work with us. So that's who I am. And that's what our colleges should be doing. Number one, we should be finding new and different ways to engage Americans ambitiously, intellectually, and rigorously, wherever that be. Number one. Number two, taking on the prison abolitionist perspective directly. This is something I tried to allude to quite a bit in the beginning of the talk, and the way the meaning of the work shifts with time. I'll tell you right now, if you asked me this question 10 or 12 years ago, I would be utterly dismissive and contemptuous. I would challenge you 10 or 12 years ago to find me a person who actually did significant time in prison to make that argument. I would challenge you to make your politics not about yourself, but about the relevance of people in prison themselves. I would challenge you to think about how we reverse the meaning of the prison system and make it work against itself. But I'll be completely honest, Michael, that now, 10 or 12 years later, I'm more conflicted with the return of Pell, with the lack of controversy, and I hope it's not just a contrarian in me, about our work. There's more capacity for the people to run the prisons to co-opt or control or censor or take away privacy or use it in their own ways. And I've become more sympathetic with that while I continue to believe in the work. So that perspective has changed over time. And in this moment when we believe less in prisons than maybe we did 10 years ago, there's more of a risk of this kind of insidious liberal streak than I think there was when the work was more controversial. The only thing I would add as a challenge to the prison abolitionist, who typically has that position from a radical left-wing or Black radical perspective, is that there's a paradox in the prison abolitionist position that I just always want to point out, which is that it presumes that when we destroy the prisons, what replaces them will not be worse. And that seems not to be consistent with the rest of American history or the thinking in that tradition.
Thank you, Max, for that very helpful response. Also, I don't see any more questions in the queue. So I know it's 10 p.m. your time. So you've been generous with being with us tonight and giving a fantastic talk. And thanks so much for engaging with these questions too. We very much appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. And I hope next time we can do it in person.
I hope so too. And thank you everybody for being with us, engaging with another program. Stay safe, and we'll see you at the next Kegley Institute event. Take care. Good night, everyone.